Don't look at who is saying it, but look at what is being said.
I am from a poor country far away from your world, and I have created a channel for you, with the hope that you will subscribe, like, comment, so that I can support my family.
We call it the Korean War. The North Koreans call it the Fatherland Liberation War. Whatever you call it, on June 25, 1950, North Korean tanks rolled across the 38th parallel, the border that separated the communist-controlled and supported North from the capitalist and Western-backed South. It was the first test of Western adherence to the Cold War doctrine of containment, a strategy to stem the forced spread of communism worldwide. Advertisement. Crew of M24 along Inchon River front Korean War -17 Aug. It was a brutal war that pitted the Soviet Union, People's Republic of China, and North Korea against the United Nations, led by the United States and South Korea. The war started with a wildly swinging pendulum of momentum that almost drove Western forces into the Sea of Japan. They were saved only by a heroic UN stand at the Pusan Perimeter and one of the most daring amphibious landings in history at Inchon. The Western counterattack drove the Communists all the way to the Yalu River, the North Korean border with China. The subsequent Chinese intervention pushed the then heavily outnumbered Americans back to the original border, and a subsequent 2-year stalemate until an armistice ended the fighting in 1953. Korean War 1950-1953. It was in Korea that some of the most legendary American military heroes said their most famous lines, made their most famous stands, and overcame seemingly insurmountable odds. The Korean War came just after the long, good fight of World War II, at a time when the world was weary of war. Just a few years later, the cultural fabric United States would be forever altered with coming of the war in Vietnam. Being sandwiched between and subsequently overshadowed by these other two, the Korean War has come to be called the Forgotten War, both by historians and the men who fought there. In an effort to relegate the nickname to the dustbin of history, here are some facts about the Korean War you may not have already known. 1. A U.S. Army sergeant in Moscow was the catalyst. Stalin prevented a war on the Korean peninsula since the end of World War II, for fear of an all-out war with the West. When the KGB recruited an army NCO from the code room at the U.S. Embassy, they discovered the U.S. had moved the bulk of its forces in the region to Japan. Stalin now believed the U.S. would not move to defend Korea and gave North Korean dictator Kim Il-sung the green light to invade the South. Stalin was wrong. The army sergeant's identity was never discovered. 2. The South was far from democratic. Rhee with General Douglas MacArthur. The first president of South Korea, Syngman Rhee, jailed or assassinated his political opponents. He also had an active secret police force to root out North Korean agents, but they detained, tortured, and killed many innocent civilians. Days after the start of the Korean War, he ordered the Bodo League massacre, killing more than 100,000 suspected communist sympathizers and their families. Rhee was ousted when thousands of protesters overran the Blue House in 1960. 3. The U.S. knew about the North's military build-up. The nascent CIA noticed the North Koreans moving their army toward their southern border, but thought it was more of a defensive measure. They reported to Secretary of State Dean Acheson that an invasion was unlikely. They didn't know the Soviets already broke American military and diplomatic codes and knew the U.S. couldn't mount an effective response to an invasion. 4. It was technically a police action. President Truman never asked Congress for a declaration of war, and Congress didn't offer one. That was back when we cared about these kinds of things. Instead, Truman placed the fighting under the aegis of the United Nations, since Korea itself was a construct of UN agreements. For the first time since WW2, U.S. troops fought in combat at Osan, 30 miles south of Seoul. 5. The U.S. dropped more ordnance on Korea than in the entire Pacific during WW2. The Korean War absolutely devastated North Korea, and this memory is a major reason why so much animosity still exists to this day. The United States dropped 635,000 tons of bombs on the North, compared to 503,000 pounds dropped on the entire Pacific theater in WW2, killing an estimated 12–15% of the population. Curtis LeMay estimated an even higher proportion. He claimed 20%. 6. It featured the first all-jet dogfight. On November 8, 1950, First Lieutenant Russell Brown engaged a MiG-15 in his F-80 Shooting Star. The MiG was clearly a superior fighter, and this discovery led to the development of the F-86 Sabre. It wasn't superior enough to allow the MiG to win the dogfight, however. Lieutenant Brown downed the communist jet. The skies over northwest Korea featured many dogfights in the war years and soon became known as a MiG alley. 7. Frostbite was one of the most prevalent injuries. Chosun Korea Marinesmen is 760,576. Thousands suffered from frostbite, while many suffered from trench foot or a combination of both. Temperatures during some of the coldest fighting were as low as -54 degrees Fahrenheit. The MASH Unit Mobile Army Surgical Hospital was just one of many battlefield medical innovations designed to stay close to the front and save the lives of more combat-injured troops. 8. Seoul changed hands 4 times. The South Korean capital sits just 35 miles from the north-south border. It was first captured by the North Koreans on June 28, 1950, just 3 days after the North invaded. It was retaken by UN forces that September. The Chinese seized the city in January 1951, but lost it 2 months after that. 9. The first year was the deadliest. Pusan Perimeter set foreman as 768,600. Roughly a quarter of all Americans killed during the Korean War died between August and December 1950, during the battles of the Pusan Perimeter, the Chosin Reservoir, and Kunyurai Pass. 178,426 UN troops died in Korea compared to more than 700,000 communists. The first American PVT. Kenneth Shadrach died near Osan. 10. Army Special Forces created an army of their own. The 8,240th Army Unit, Army Rangers and other soldiers with experience in partisan warfare from World War II raised and advised local partisan armies in Korea on how to fight behind enemy lines and sabotage the communists. The 8,240th would advise more than 38,000 partisan fighters. 11. It was more than just Americans and Koreans fighting communists. 996 Ethiopian soldiers, Korean women is 768,596. Ethiopian troops fighting in Korea. Being a UN police action, other countries joined the coalition of forces fighting to keep the South safe for capitalism, if not democracy. Significant forces came from Great Britain and the Commonwealth countries, especially Australia and Canada. Turkish forces faced their biggest military challenge since World War I at the Battle of Kunyurai Pass. Other countries who gave significant troops included Ethiopia, Colombia, Thailand and the Philippines. 12. Generals weren't far from the fighting. These days, you don't hear much about general officers in the thick of the action unless they're visiting a combat unit or are on some sort of tour or inspection. That wasn't true during the Korean War. General Douglas MacArthur went to Korea himself during the Battle of the Pusan Perimeter to assess the situation there and determine how to proceed. The Inchon landing is what he came up with. 50,475 by 558,746. From left to right, Puller, MacArthur, and now P. Smith. Army General William F. Dean was among the last to retreat from Inchon as the North advanced. He wanted to make sure all his men and material made it out as orderly and safely as possible. While trying to help a wounded troop, Dean was knocked unconscious and captured by the Communists. As the war raged on in and around the peninsula, a slew of generals would find themselves in combat. Oliver P. Smith directed the breakout of the Marines surrounded the Chosin Reservoir and led them back to the port of Hungnam. Chesty Puller was still racking up awards and decorations in Korea. He was promoted to brigadier general after landing at Inchon and fighting at the Chosin. 13. The Korean War never ended. S4,266,845 15. Armistice talks took more than 2 years to complete. The real hang-up was over the repatriation of POWs. Eventually, the North conceded and an armistice was signed. The signatories didn't end the war, however, just the fighting. The war continues to this day.